Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, CEO, Africa Center, Uzodinma Iweala.
Hi, guys. Okay, you guys, I know you had fantastic Friday nights, and that's probably why you're a little bit subdued this morning, but hello, good morning. That's what I'm talking about. Welcome this morning. We have a fantastic program for you about freedom of expression, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But before I do that, I think we have some commitments to announce. So I would like to talk a little bit about that. As you guys know, we're all about making commitments that are transformative here. So I think the first person I wanted to talk about who's made a commitment is James Lott of the University of Chicago. James, if you'll come on up. So in 2017, there were over 70,000 deaths in the US from drug overdoses, an increase of over 10% in just 1 year. 2/3 of those deaths involved opioids. Drug overdoses are expected to remain as the leading cause of death for Americans under 50. And for every overdose that results in death, there are many more non-fatal ones. So how is James addressing this? Fighting the opioid epidemic with digital technology seeks to prevent substance addictions and end the social stigma associated with them by providing life-saving resources. Through the website Naloxone Exchange, people struggling with substance abuse and addiction and their loved ones can order the overdose antidote naloxone, order clean needles, and access private telecounseling naloxone. Naloxone can immediately reverse a potentially fatal overdose by blocking or reversing the effects of opioids, such as extreme drowsiness, slowed breathing, and loss of consciousness. A low-cost order of naloxone can either be shipped for free through the website, or a prescription can be relayed to local pharmacies around the country. It's HIPAA compliant, and it ensures patient privacy. The digital platform will include an e-discussion forum that features first-person accounts of addiction. Resources will be designed for people in every stage of the addiction process. Fighting the opioid epidemic with digital technology seeks to save lives and provide emotional and medical support for people struggling with addiction to end the downward spiral of hopelessness, despair, and isolation. So, James, thank you so much for your commitment. James, hold up. All right, so thank you to James for the work that you're doing. And next, who's also made a commitment, we have Rebecca Castillo. Rebecca, if you want to come on out from Swarthmore. Rebecca is at Swarthmore College. Hey, Rebecca, how are you? So the challenge. Media literacy education is critical to developing informed and engaged citizens and giving a voice to the unheard. But in low-income countries communities around the country, students lack the arts and media education that their more well-to-do peers enjoy. The film industry lacks diversity and deprives women and people of color of a voice. So how is Rebecca addressing it? Storyboard, her organization, is an arts and media education program for high school students in Chester, Pennsylvania. The program gives young people in underserved areas the powerful ability through media literacy and production skills to communicate a narrative regarding issues that affect their communities. Students learn to create a media voice and to interpret the media messages around them. Programs will be semester-long and have curricula designed in partnership with the local school district and a local nonprofit filmmaking organization. Storyboard focuses on both media theory and media production skills that together create meaningful communications. High school students will apply to storyboard programs with a specific story they wish to tell. They'll learn to produce a multimedia presentation, including a short film, a photo essay, and a written piece. A screening for the community will take place at the end of the program. Storyboard will also offer students field trips to see how media organizations operate, to network with professionals, and to tour institutions of higher education. Storyboard success will be evaluated by pre- and post-program media literacy tests, and the grades achieved, jobs obtained, and colleges attended by program participants. Rebecca, thank you very much for your commitment. I didn't know it was Rebecca's birthday, but if we want to sing happy birthday, we totally can. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rebecca. Happy birthday to you. Thank you. All right, well, that's a really good way to start off the day, isn't it? All right, guys, so commitments we've done, and now we're going to talk about something that is, I'm sure, near and dear to all of you right now, something that's quite important, and that's freedom of expression. We have a great panel today with 4 really distinguished and dynamic speakers to talk about free expression. Now, the battle for free expression is pretty much as old as speech itself. And in the last century, it appears that the line between those who supported freedom of expression and those who tried to stifle it, that all seems pretty clear. But in the 21st century, our century, it seems that this might be a little bit confused. We've got discussions about the limits of hate speech and political correctness. We've got politicians body slamming or possibly dismembering journalists. We've got fake news. We've got concerns about privacy and perhaps the not so positive role of technology in this transformation that we're going through. So I would like to invite our guests up to the stage so that we can have this discussion. So first I'd ask Ben Schwerin, who's the Vice President of Partnerships at SNAP, to come on out. And then Susan Herman, who's the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and the Centennial Professor of Law at Brooklyn College, and Julio Martinez Ellsberg, a member of the Nicaraguan Platform for Social Movements and Civil Society Organizations. And finally, Khoi, an independent activist and artist from Vietnam. All right, and there's me too, so I'm gonna go sit down. Hello, okay. Hi guys. Thank you very much for joining me up on the stage today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So there's a lot going on when it comes to freedom of expression, and not all of it necessarily seems super positive. So, I mean, my first question to you all is, are we gonna be okay? With all the challenges that we're facing in terms of people being able to talk about basically to express themselves freely, to talk about the things that matter to them, and the clampdown, it seems, in different areas of the world. What is most important to you? What's first and foremost on your mind in terms of what we need to be doing to ensure the freedom of expression around the world? Julio, I'll start with you.
Sure. The first thing I think is to stay to the streets. I mean, march, be visible, use social media, but also organize, go to the marches. I mean, those are the kind of things that really reach all levels of society, and don't stop until you get results. And then you start having your local authorities respecting your own rights, your own basic rights.
May?
The first thing that I think about freedom of expression, right now, freedom of expression is under threat all around the world, and especially in my country. And we
Your country
really,
being Vietnam.
Yes, and we really need to be together to promote for freedom of expression more.
Susan?
Well, I think the first thing that I think of is that it's a different conversation depending where in the world you are. Because although in the United States we do now have some threats to freedom of expression, I don't know how many people know, for example, that hundreds of people were arrested at the inauguration of Donald Trump. And the federal government, as well as state governments, are really talking about limiting freedom of assembly. But I think that in the United States, I'm pretty optimistic about being free from that kind of government suppression, because over the past 100 years, since the ACLU was founded in 1920, the courts have really learned to take part in trying to prevent the government from deciding who can speak and who can't speak. So my greater concern, I think, than the United States government, and it'll be interesting to have this conversation internationally, but my greater concern is that I think people are losing sight of the basic principle about the value of having everybody's voice heard in a democracy. And I think that more and more people don't want to hear speech that they find offensive. They want to shut it down, whether it's not inviting people to speak in a school or not letting performers perform. And it's on all sides of the political divide. And so my greatest concern is I think that people are losing sight of the value of free speech and not just their own point of view.
And Ben?
Yeah, so I think social media had a lot of promise, and it's actually done a lot of good things for the world. It's connected people. It's made self-expression much easier than ever before. It's now easier to consume information. It's easier for people to organize and promote free societies. But I also think we've seen recently, or we've become more aware, that can also be used for nefarious purposes. It's been weaponized in many places in the world. And I think it's up to platforms like us to make sure that we're regulating the type of content that's being broadcast on our services.
Right. So let's talk about something I think that's going to be first and foremost in your minds. Let's talk about social media and its role in the changing landscape when it comes to freedom of expression. Now, you were talking about the weaponizing of social media, and we know that we've talked a lot about the impact it's had on the U.S. elections, but also worldwide, in terms of giving people who haven't had a voice, like May, we talked about this earlier, access to a larger number of people in an unregulated fashion, but at the same time, the proliferation of disinformation or bullying. I mean, how do you guys at SNAP deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, so I think first it's helpful to get a little context on SNAP and our philosophy. And Snapchat is not really social media. It's about helping people develop closer relationships with the people who they care about the most. And we're trying to empower expression, in creativity. And it's not about, we don't have comments, we don't have likes. And what you find in social media is that when you have comments, when you have likes, the posts that are negative, the posts that are controversial, those are the ones that the algorithm is favoring. Right. And those are the ones that get pushed to the top of people's news feeds. What we've tried to say is, okay, we know that most people on Snapchat are spending most of their time communicating with their closest friends. However, 55% of college students in the US have gotten their news from Snapchat in the past week, right? So we have a responsibility there. So we said very early on, we're going to make sure that all the news content is produced by professionals and handpicked by our editorial team. And we have very strict content guidelines. And one of those guidelines is it has to be fact-checked. It has to be accurate. And then obviously we prohibit harassment and bullying and threats. And I think, we've taken that approach from very early on, and you shouldn't have to have 1 billion users to realize that this is important. And what we've seen
not so subtle dig.
Well,
there.
no, but look, I think what we've seen in the U.S. obviously, but also around the world is that it's in places where there aren't strong institutions, where there isn't strong infrastructure, this can become a very dangerous tool, and we can talk more about that as we go.
May, I wanted to turn it over to you really quickly, because you have used social media platforms to reach, I guess, about 53 million people in Vietnam who have been exposed to your music, to your art. What has social media done for your activism?
Before social media in Vietnam, we have nowhere to go and express freely because government control extended to every aspect of social life. And when social media come, it changed it. I can see the public debate was no longer restricted to the state-run media. And we can talk about policy, we can talk about corruption, and we also can access uncensored information. Also, we can organize the peaceful protest. When I nominated myself for the National Assembly election in 2016, preventing the laws from campaigning to the public, I have to use Facebook to create the big debate about democracy and the right to participate in politics. Yeah. Also, when I'm banned from singing in public, Facebook allowed me to release my album online. I mean, yes. And when I've met with President Obama in the meeting with civil society representatives in Hanoi in 2016, the social media is only platform was talking about this. So, I mean, social media really like important tool for us to express ourselves.
So in terms of, I guess you're saying in terms of being able to organize and to reach and to get around some of the strictures, which I think, Susan, you were talking about. I want to come back to that. But I know that, Julio, you've also mentioned, go ahead.
Yes, but it's very dangerous now because the internet is not free now. And Facebook is being abused to silence dissent.
Right.
So it's under the threat now.
Right, Julio, I saw you nod your head a bit when she said the internet or Facebook is not free. What has been your experience in terms of getting people out and getting your message out using social media?
So I would say that the civic uprising that started in Nicaragua about 6 months ago would not have been possible without social media. Because in Nicaragua, the government owns about 80% of the media. And so when people started taking the streets and say to protest peacefully, they were beaten by pro-government mobs. The government said that didn't happen, and through all of their state media, they started talking about a different line, and something about these hooligans having nothing to do with the government that were carrying this out. But everyone has a cell phone, and a lot of the people that were being beaten, people that were outside of it, were filming all this on Facebook Live. So you get to this point where it was completely absurd that anyone would believe the government, because every time that the protesters would come out, they would be filming it the entire time, and so you knew that the police was the one shooting at your friends. Yeah. And it was that made this movement viral. Everyone, all of society, seeing those images of young people, especially university students, being shot at, and that's what made everyone else come out.
Now, Susan, I wanted to quickly pick up another line on this social media discussion and debate with you. We had talked about it a bit earlier, which is something that Ben had said about self-regulation, and you mentioned it a little bit now about how you police these platforms. But let's talk about that from your perspective as a lawyer, as somebody who thinks a lot about the structures around freedom of expression. What do you think about sort of the idea of platforms self-regulating themselves and the benefits or dangers of that?
Well, I think as May and Julio were both saying, there's both the good news and the bad news about social media. The ACLU also uses social media a lot to organize, and we just post videos and things like that. So in some ways, it's like a megaphone, and it's terrific. But it's not only that social media is a place where all private people can do things. It's as if the social media company have become the government in a kind of a new public square. So what I would not like to see happen is I would not like to see the government regulating social media. and saying you can't do this, you must do that, because I think that would be what we've always worried about most at the ACLU is government power, causing this to be heard and that not to be heard. But we also have our problems with the social media policies. Ben was describing a kind of enlightened policy of trying to not publish and limit the things that are, in fact, unlawful, like harassment and bullying and inciting people to violence. That's unlawful. But where we start pushing back is when the media are censoring things that they find offensive. So, some company might have decided they didn't like May's performance, and they wouldn't allow that. I'll tell you two quick stories. So a few years ago, there was an ACLU lawyer who wrote a blog piece about a case that she was working on, which involved a statue, a public art statue in a town in Kansas, that the town wanted to take down because somebody had discovered that the statue involved a woman who had her breasts bared. So, the big question of can the government censor art like that? Right. So the lawyer wrote a story about this, and accompanying the story, she had a picture of the statue. Facebook wouldn't publish it.
Right.
It failed their obscenity algorithms. There have been many other circumstances where other companies, Twitter and so forth, will not publish something that fails the racial slur test because somebody has taken a screenshot of racial slurs that they've received, like nasty comments that people have made, and they want to report a racist incident to people, and that fails the algorithm.
Right.
So, one of the things that Facebook came up with a couple of years ago that I thought was interesting, which is not about the algorithms, where clearly you need human beings to do that, and they're not always perfect either. But Facebook came up with this idea in terms of fake news, of instead of just suppressing and not publishing something that was considered to be fake, they would send it out to a neutral fact checker, and if it came up with a red flag, they wouldn't take down the piece, but they would publish it with the red flag.
Right.
And so I'm very interested in Ben's ideas about how that can be made to work, to not censor offensive speech, but to make people more accountable for what they're saying.
I totally agree, and I think I want to give a little historical context here. So you think about TV and radio, right? So the FCC was created in 1934, and basically they said, okay, look, there's limited spectrum, so if you want to have a broadcast license, you're going to be subject to certain content guidelines. And that's how it's been for decades. Now, that's not how it works on the internet, right? Now, there's something called the Communications Decency Act, and this was signed in 1996. And some people think this is the most important tool that's allowed free speech on the internet, because what happened was platforms like ours are safe harbored. They're not liable for the content that people are posting, outside of a couple of exceptions. But that means that we as platforms need to self-regulate. It's our responsibility to say, how are we looking at the content that's being published on our platform? Content that may be false, content that may be hate speech, content that may be bullying or harassment. And you can't identify that only with algorithms. It just doesn't work. You need humans to do the job. And I think what we've seen, and I touched on this earlier, is that in countries like Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, platforms like Facebook have gone in and said, okay, data is really expensive. We're going to make deals with the wireless carriers to make Facebook free. And what happens is Facebook becomes the internet in these places. So you don't have the checks and balances of traditional media sources saying, okay, here's what the truth is. So what you end up having is Facebook being the internet, people reading information that may or may not be accurate, may or may not be propaganda, and they're sharing it with their friends, and that's becoming reality. That's becoming facts, and that's been very dangerous.
Right. Go ahead, Susan.
Actually, just one more thing in terms of what I think would be useful regulation, because as you say, it doesn't help if Facebook becomes the government and decides what people can say what, and you can't say this, you can say that. So I think as part of we need more accountability in terms of anybody can post anything. People can just say whatever they want, and that's clearly not always a pleasant thing. But it seems to me that the companies also need to be both accountable and transparent about what they're doing. So what I'd like to see is if Facebook is going to take down content or any other company on the internet, that there should be an appeals process that you can go through, and there should be some accountability and transparency for who's making those decisions and why.
Maya, I see you nodding your head.
Right. I had a meeting with Facebook just yesterday, and I am asking Facebook stop allowing their platform to be abused. You know, Troll Farm and Cyber Army, the government supporters, they abuse Facebook community standard to silence dissent, to have critical post delete and account lock. And this happening every day now in Vietnam. And it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous for us, especially the cybersecurity law now in Vietnam is coming in practice, and it's asking the social media companies like Facebook provide the personal information for the government, and they ask these companies to remove the content in 24 hours when the government required. So it's really hurt freedom of expression.
It's a big deal. I don't want it to seem like we're dishing on Facebook. You know, they've done some good things too, I think. So I do want to shift the conversation, although Ben, I think you had something you wanted to add there. Not that you're not biased or anything.
No, I love Facebook. No, look, I think that we have to better understand the business models that these companies have to understand why this is happening. So again, not to be overly negative about Facebook, but half of their revenue is generated overseas now, right? So our company, their company, Twitter, these companies are valued by potential growth in the future. So it's advantageous for them to go into these new markets, to do these deals that make their services free. And I think if that's going to happen, that it's our responsibility to say, hey, if we're going to go invest in these new markets, if we're going to start potentially displacing traditional institutions like local newspapers, like media, then it's also our responsibility to have local teams on the ground who are helping to moderate content. And it is not okay to just say, we have people sitting in Silicon Valley or in Los Angeles who are going to make these decisions. We need to invest to make sure that the right kind of content is being broadcast if we want to have a business in these countries.
Sure. So I want to just switch direction a little bit, because we've talked a lot about sort of the news sphere. And yes, we're all young folks in this room, and technology is such a big part of communication and expression now, but that doesn't change the fact that people are still people. We still are physical humans, right? At least in my case. And you know, you still have to stand up in front of people and talk to them at some point in time. Now, Julio, I know a lot of what you're doing has to do with that as well. It's not just activism on the screens, it's activism and freedom of speech in the streets. So I wanted to talk to you, or get you to say a couple words about what that's like sort of in a real sense when you've got people out and the challenges that you face as somebody who is really protesting for, you know, especially for folks here who in this environment are starting to see an upsurge of how important it is to just have bodies actually out there in the streets speaking their truth.
I think that being out on the streets makes a big difference. And it was taking the streets, that is marching, that is putting pressure on the government, that really started, one, convincing a much broader sense of society to be part of it, because once you're in social media, you know, you have your own network and maybe you're not reaching everyone. It's different when you're taking over a road, for instance, because of the injustice. I mean, that reaches many more people. The situation in Nicaragua, however, is that they saw that so much as a threat that they sent first mobs to beat up the people that were marching, and then as the marches grew larger and larger because the students became outraged about what was going on, that made it so that they sent the police to started shooting rubber bullets, and then moved on to live ammunition, and then essentially until we had the first few dead, and that made all the rest of society kind of take the marches in all the cities in Nicaragua and really start putting pressure from every position that they could. But in response, the government has cracked down both through social media, both through as well as jailing people without warrants, as well as continuing to shoot people who are protesting, to the point where we now have 500 people who have been killed and 400 people who are currently in jail, all because of a movement that was asking for basic human rights, starting with freedom of expression. So it comes with a lot of risk, but it's that's really made the difference, and that's put the government in a position where they are isolated now, and hopefully will start creating the change that we've been asking for.
So let me ask to both of you guys who have actually faced governments that are in some ways like very intent on making you not speak. I mean, are you scared, and how do you deal with your fear? It's a personal question, but we're just in front of 1,000 people, so.
Yeah, we're all friends here. Yeah, I mean, logically, there's persecution to anyone who speaks out and anyone who has a real reach to anyone. So that's why there are at least 23,000 people living in refuge in Costa Rica right now, and most leaders who are not in jail are in hiding or no longer live in their houses. I have to figure out when I'm going back, but for now, kind of my added value is to kind of let people know about it from here. But yeah, there's real fear of anyone who has spoken out against the government in Nicaragua right now. The persecution is the head of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that's a Latin American body, has called essentially Nicaragua a state of exemption, where there is no more rule of law. So just to give you an idea, you are at the mercy of whether or not they find you.
And Mai?
Yes, I actually always live in fear. I always scared, but I'm still do what I feel right. Just because express myself freely has led me to many problems. I was evicted from my house in the middle of the night. I was detained at the airport for hours. I was under surveillance, and I could be in jail anytime if they want to arrest me. But I believe in my feeling, and I have to very careful what I say, what I write, to avoid that the government can pick that like the evidence to put me in jail. Like that is the way we act.
No, Susan, because we're talking about bodies in the streets, and we're going to get into some really complicated stuff, because I think what the ACLU really supports is the right of everyone to be in the streets. But now we've gotten into maybe some confused situations where the ACLU is defending protesters in Charlottesville who are maybe proponents of hate speech. The ACLU is famous for the Skokie case, where you defended the rights of Nazis to march in the streets. How do you, in this environment where it does seem that like there are actual people, bodies under threat by what seems to have been the mainstreaming of hate speech, where do you guys sit with that, and how do you think about that when it comes to who you defend and who you protect?
Great question, because we do think about those things a lot. But a couple of things, I think I want to step back a little bit and talk about the bodies in the street and the demonstrations, because that's what we've always been about. In 1920, it was labor trying to organize and anti-war protesters. Roger Baldwin, one of the founders of the ACLU, liked to get himself arrested for standing up on top of a car and reading out our First Amendment about the right to free speech. And he was demonstrating without a permit. So he liked the irony of being arrested for reading out the First Amendment. During the Civil Rights era, you were representing the people who were out there on the street, protesting to try to get the right to vote. And the great congressman and civil rights hero John Lewis said that without the freedom of speech and assembly, the civil rights movement in the United States would have been a bird without wings. So, we're still representing people at Standing Rock. But sort of moving ahead to the people we don't agree with. And this is where I think a really interesting discussion here, which I've always wondered about. To me, what the ACLU does is classic First Amendment theory that works in the United States. I'm not altogether sure how transferable some of our principles would be internationally. I don't know, if I lived in Germany, I might think it was very appropriate to have a law that you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust. But being in the United States, where we have a very diverse community, where we count on the courts to guarantee people's free speech, the ACLU takes the same position that we think the government should take, which is that we shouldn't be choosing who gets to speak and who doesn't speak. That if you're not doing something that counts as incitement to violence or harassment or bullying, if you're not actually doing something that creates a danger, the fact that you're saying things that people find offensive should not be a reason for the government, and that's always our beginning, to tell you you can't speak. So our feeling is, why do we represent the people who want to demonstrate in Charlottesville? It's sure not because we agree with them or we want to empower them. But once you say Charlottesville has the right to say that people who want to be white, spout white supremacist garbage don't have a right to speak, then another city can say that Black Lives Matter can't have a protest because they're going to define that as offensive and dangerous and scary. And I have never seen a hate speech law that is not vague and that would not give the government the power to say, well, what you're doing is offensive, what you're doing is offensive. So our position is that we're content neutral. We do not refuse to represent anybody on the basis of the content of their speech. If they want to be violent or do something that's harassment or bullying, something like that, that's different. But I think there are a number of reasons for that, and one is sort of the principled reason. As a Supreme Court justice once said, in a democracy, everyone must be the watchman of his own truth. So for the government to decide what you're saying is okay, you can say that and you can't say that, whether it's in a demonstration or if it's a speaker at a public university or if it's what somebody wants to post on the internet, at that point, the people aren't running the government is running the people. So a lot of our reaction and a lot of our concern about we just have to be content neutral is about that. Now, the second thing I want to say about that is I was saying at the beginning that I think one of our greatest dangers to free speech now is not just government. In some places in the world, that's a very real and enormous danger. And let me say, people often tell me that they admire the people who work for the ACLU, who fight for freedom and liberty. And I tell people all the time that who we're in awe of are our clients. It's the people who are out there at Standing Rock and out on the streets and demonstrating and putting themselves on the line. But what I think now is that there are so many people who like to speak more than they like to listen. And in our hyper-partisan country that we're living in, free speech doesn't do a lot of good if you're only in your own echo chamber and nobody else is listening to your point of view. And I think that where we have to start fighting back is exactly in the universities. So if a university has a speaker come in who's somebody who you very much disagree with, what's a better reaction? Is it better to say, you're not allowed to speak here, go away? What have you done? First of all, you've made that person a victim and a martyr, and they've now deflected all the attention and sucked all the air out of the room because we now have to talk about why don't they have a right, and are you being intolerant of their ideas? I think the better approach, the classic First Amendment approach, is that the antidote to bad speech is more speech. So I think what you do is if you have a hateful speaker, thank you. And I'd like to see more schools really figure out programs for if you're going to have a speaker like a white supremacist or somebody who you just think is just, you totally disagree with what they say. Instead of saying you can't speak here, so have a week program around their speech and teach people. Get them to read what this person's saying, what are the good arguments about why they're wrong, and reason them down, don't shout them down. And that to me is what schools should be doing because that is education. Teach people how to argue people down.
Let me press you a bit, and then I'll ask Ben to, because I saw Ben had a thought. What if you have a situation? How do you decide what is speech that isn't insightful or not? Let's say you have somebody who gets up and says that is extremely hateful in their speech against black people, for example, or is denying the existence of slavery. Is that not aggressive bullying and sort of detrimental to the well-being of a whole set of people, or is that just freedom of expression?
Well, I think I could get legal on this because there are a lot of legal standards about what
I'm
counts
not a lawyer, so go ahead.
I don't think anybody wants to do that. But there is a line that you draw between if somebody is saying something that is likely to incite people right away. Like if I were to say to this audience, I want you to go out and kill X. That's inciting people to do something right away. The idea about more speech is that as long as you have some time to think about it, even if I say, something really horrible about, slavery or whatever, there's time for people to think about it. I'm not urging them to act immediately. And therefore, that harm can be countered by counter-argument. So the metaphor about the First Amendment is that it creates a marketplace of ideas. And the hope has always been that if you can cross-examine ideas and really talk about them, that people will see what's wrong with the bad ideas.
Right.
And so even if it's an offensive idea, I think sometimes people have to just take a deep breath and say, okay, I hate this idea. I talked to one African-American student at a college who said, bring him on. I want to out-argue that guy. I want to show people where they're just wrong. And that, I think, does some good. Not allowing them to speak doesn't do any good. The one more thing I want to say is that I think one reason why people tend to feel threatened on a campus when a racist speaker comes in is that there's background usually at that university. And there's some other reason why those students already feel marginalized. Right. And that, to me, is an important issue. And that's why I do not want to see, Alex Jones who's going to get all the attention, or, Milo, or whoever it is, by coming to a college and having everybody talk about that. Then what they should be talking about is, why do these students feel marginalized?
Right.
What can we do better to make them feel that they're really part of the community?
Ben, marginalization.
Yeah. I think that humans are inherently tribal. We're inherently drawn to people who have similar interests. And I think social media has really accelerated that. That may actually end up being the legacy of social media in some ways. If you look at the intense polarization that there is in the United States right now, it's really increased in the past 5 to 10 years, meaning that people have very strong negative feelings for the other political party. And that's, if you look at that curve, how people answer these questions, it tracks with the expansion of social media. And I think that means that we maybe need to rethink how people are consuming information on these platforms. And maybe it isn't the best thing to have the posts that your friends are sharing that are the most negative or that are generating the most controversy be given the highest ranking in an algorithm. Maybe that doesn't make the most sense. And I think that the other side to that is that social media, I think, actually has served a very positive role in increasing civic engagement. So, obviously the midterms are coming up in the United States. This is a very important election, no matter what side you're on. We partnered with TurboVote on an initiative, and in the past couple of weeks, we've actually registered hundreds of thousands of people to vote. And we're going to be announcing those numbers next week. And here's what's so exciting about that. More than half of them are 18 to 24. So
that's pretty amazing.
Great. Yeah, and I think, I mentioned that we want to empower self-expression, and that also means that we want to help people influence who they want representing them in government, and we want to help them shape the futures of their communities. And we're going to be doing a lot more to help people find their polling places, to remind them to get out and vote. So we're really excited about that, and we're not the only ones. Other platforms are doing the same, and I think that's a great development.
If I could just add one thing, you're talking about education through social media. I think another really important thing that's lacking in a lot of our schools around the world is education about social media. So this is like a whole new world that people have to navigate. And I've heard of some schools that now actually teach courses in what do you do with all this information? How do you figure out what's true, what's not true? How do you decide what you're going to forward, what you're not going to forward? How do you evaluate news that you get from all these different media? And I think that's a really important function. I mean, schools are still teaching students how to navigate the physical world. And I think very few schools are teaching students how to navigate the world of social media and how to be critical and really make good decisions.
And how often have all of us in this room probably forwarded or shared a post that we haven't even read, right? You just read a headline and you think, oh, let me share this. And I think we need to be more thoughtful about how we're teaching people about the content that they're reading online.
Julio.
I just wanted to mention that I completely agree with the need to fight, not just for our own kind of ideas to be out there and be allowed for us to speak, but for the principle. I mean, what we're pushing forward in the streets and all the marches in Nicaragua is for the principle that we can have a complete debate and not be shut down. And if we ask for that for ourselves, we also have to allow them to say things that we completely disagree with, and that's part of it. So I think we have to focus on that principle. Also, just kind of going back a little bit about this whole thing about fear. In the marches, yes, there's plenty of fear. There's 6 months, but also kind of reiterate how what's most exceptional about what's happened over the 6 months is the dignity with which Nicaraguan young people in a nonviolent movement have been pushing forward Despite all of the repression, despite the jailings and the attacks and everything else, there hasn't been a single week in 6 months without a protest, without people in the streets. Even when 2 weeks ago, the government said that marches of any sort were illegal. So I just wanted to point that out.
Right. So you guys bring up something that I think is really interesting, which is this idea of polite society. You mentioned dignity. You mentioned listening to people. You mentioned that conservatives in your country or conservative values have kind of shut you down in certain ways. How do you, in some ways, what's the relationship of the idea to express yourself freely and the need for, I guess, norms that allow for, responsible civil engagement? When is it okay to not be polite, I guess is the question.
Well, kind of going back to the United States Constitution, it seems to me that what the First Amendment is all about, the whole idea of free speech and free expression, is partially a political idea that you want to have all the points of view represented. And I couldn't agree more with what Julio just said, that it's a matter of principle as opposed to point of view. And I feel like what people are feeling tempted to do these days because of the incredible hyperpartisanship of our society is to only pay attention to ideas or anything that further their point of view. And that's part of, I think, the assault on truth as well. People will propound, they will disseminate and accept all sorts of misinformation if it promotes what they would like to be true. For example, immigrants are criminals. Climate change is not man-made. And we know from the psychologists and many other people that people will, there's this confirmation bias, that you only accept facts that agree with your point of view. And so I think that what we really need to do, as Julio is saying, and I think this is also what I was saying before, is to get back to the principle that your speech is as important as my speech, and that we should all be in the marketplace of ideas together. So I find really inspiring that the people who wrote the Constitution couldn't agree on anything. There were the anti-federalists and the federalists, and they couldn't agree on anything in terms of what the results should be. They couldn't agree about slavery. They're just really basic things. But they did agree on neutral principles, that everybody should get to have their own say and be part of the polity, and that everybody should be treated fairly, et cetera. So I think that's a real inspiration. If we could get back to the fundamental principles, which I think a lot of people don't want to pay attention to these days, because they only want to see and hear and read things that favor their own point of view. I think that's where we need to go.
I'm going to say I wish they had been able to agree on slavery, but let's take it to...
But which way?
Right. Let's take it to student questions. And I think we have one from Khoi, who I think it gets to some of what we were talking about, which is, when is it, when expression crosses into morally questionable behavior, is it ever appropriate to punish speech? Let me toss that out to you guys. Is it ever appropriate to do someone down for morally questionable speech?
Yes. If what they've done is crossed the line, again, into harassment or bullying, I'll give you a disgusting example that I don't remember, fortunately, which college this occurred at. But there were some students who thought it would really be amusing to post a photograph of a lynching on the dorm room door of an African-American woman. Now, that's not just speech, that's harassment, that's targeting her. And, you can be punished for your speech if your speech, in fact, contains things that cross the line.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of maybe a tangent in a way, but one of the reasons why we take these content guidelines so seriously is not just about fake news and misinformation. It is about bullying. It is about hate speech. It's about really using our service or other services to make people unhappy or feel bad about themselves. And I think this is something that is just has become a part of social media, where people want the validation of getting a lot of comments or getting likes on their photos or their videos. And that becomes a pattern where you get a lot of likes, you get a lot of comments, you want to project this perfect version of yourself to the world. And there's a lot of pressure that gets put on young people, especially, to feel like they're perfect. And what we're seeing, I think, is that there's a lot of negative effects to that. There's a lot of negative mental health impact to that. I think people are having problems with self-esteem. And I think, again, it's up to platforms like ours to make sure that we're not just talking about, governments or bad actors on the global stage sharing fake news or misinformation, but it's also up to us to make sure that the community are not spreading hate speech, are not bullying, are not harassing people, because we're seeing that there's a generation of people now who are living with a lot of anxiety and depression because they constantly feel like they're under pressure to be perfect, and they're being judged by everything that they do. And I think we need to, again, I think our company and other companies have to have some responsibility for that.
Right, which takes us to another question from Kimberly, and this is for Julio and Mai. How do you, in developing countries, and I'm not going to say corrupt, but I'm going to say in countries where you don't have the same perhaps infrastructure or strong institutions, in these countries, in countries like yours where freedom of speech is being threatened, what are you doing actively to keep speech alive? I mean, I guess is their question. I mean, there's marching, but what other things do you guys do?
Because I'm an artist, so I use art and music to spread my message and to encourage people to express themselves more freely. And I encourage other artists work without thinking about the censorship system. And from that, I think it can help to keep freedom of expression in the space that we need to keep it.
Because of necessity, the Nicaraguan people have gotten very, creative about how to express themselves. So, for instance, once marching was completely illegal, people started doing things like blowing up balloons, and balloons in the colors of the national flag, and cities throughout the country you would wake up and you would have these balloons, asking for freedom and asking for, with the names of the people that have been jailed, all the students that are in jail, and so you would have these absurd images of state employees and police popping the balloons, kind of like going through the streets, just popping one by one. That in terms of expression, but everything from art, from theater, everyone drawing attention to pressure, and pressure for the liberty of people, and to pressure for the ability to express themselves. Also, kind of drawing in the rest of the sectors of society, it made it so that, say, the farm workers set up roadblocks until the repression ended. The private sector, who were originally with the government, they did 3 national strikes. So, and this is all pressure that started from the pressure from the streets. But you make everybody else in society pressure from wherever they have power.
Right. So let's talk about social media. I think that's on everyone's mind. And we've talked a lot about what social media does, but how can we undo some of that? How can we break through these echo chambers, Ben?
So I think that presenting diverse points of view to everyone is incredibly important. So when we launched our news platform, we specifically tried to bring on publishers who have different points of view. And again, I mentioned this before, but what you see when you study engagement on social media is that posts that stoke or trigger primal emotions, hatred, anger, those are the ones that get the most engagement. And if you look at, even through the Supreme Court confirmation process, if you look at on Facebook, which posts got the most engagement, the vast majority were coming from sort of extreme right-wing sources. So it's up to, again, I've said this a lot, it's up to platforms like ours to make sure that it doesn't happen by not necessarily using an algorithm that's triggered by extreme negativity or controversy, and making sure that there are a diverse, authoritative, credible news sources that are presented to people, so they're not just seeing one point of view, or they're not just seeing the points of view from their friends or family who may be thinking the same way. And it's easier said than done.
But let me say, I think you can't just do that, again, from the point of view of social media, which is where I think the schools have to be involved. One metaphor I read, which I think is very appropriate, somebody said that being human beings, we tend to be attracted to the salt, the sugar, and the fat. And that's what you're saying. So how do you learn to eat a diet that's not all salt and sugar and fat when that's your instinct? I want to eat things that are bad for me. Somebody has to teach you about nutrition. And I don't think Snapchat and Facebook are going to be teaching us about nutrition. They can be the platform where there's a complete cafeteria where all the foods are available. But somebody has to convince you that you shouldn't always go for the diet of the sugar and the salt. I've also seen there are a number of people who've started their own startups. There was one called something like Better Bridge or something like that, which become places where people of different points of view will intersect and have to talk to each other. When I was in 5th grade, I had a pen pal who was a girl in France, and we wrote to each other about our different lives. And I would love to see a big platform. Again, maybe this is something that schools could do, where people from red states and blue states would have to match up and have to talk to each other to try to figure out what they have in common.
All right, we're not going to talk about the fact that I ate M&Ms for breakfast today, then. But Julio. Yeah.
I'll pass it on to you.
We are.
Oh, okay, so I'll read the next question then. We had a little breakdown.
This is the next question. Right?
Okay, yeah. So I think this is from Joseph, who wants to know what responsibilities institutions have to fight the spread of disinformation. I guess fake news and all that other nonsense. Do you want to?
Well, look, I think how are we defining institutions? So if institutions are social media or internet platforms, it is our responsibility to moderate content that's being distributed. I think that it's on us to do it. I think it's better us than the government, but we may get to a point where governments say, you know what, these platforms aren't doing enough. And one of the most dangerous things that you see happening, you see it in the US, you see it elsewhere, is that you see authoritarian governments trying to discredit traditional institutions like the media, to say, don't believe anything you read, right? Just believe us. I'm the only source of truth. And the internet or social media platforms is a great way to proliferate that message. So look, it's the institutions that can fix this or stop it are the platforms. And if it's not the platforms, it's going to have to be governments. And I agree with you that that's not ideal.
Or schools.
Or schools.
Yeah. I think the first thing is to not create false news, which is what they do in Nicaragua. It's the first thing. But also, I think that there should be lots more transparency in terms of who's creating the information. A lot of information, that there's some sort of private interest, whether it's a government or a company who are putting out news. And I think that often it's not clear who's doing it. So I think regulation in terms of transparency and who's behind the news and if there's money behind it, I think is important.
I just want to add that you're totally right. And one of the biggest problems is that you have bad actors, sometimes government or military agencies who are setting up fake accounts to appear like they're influencers, and they're getting millions of followers, and then they're spreading propaganda. Right. So the fact that we don't even know who's behind these accounts is incredibly problematic.
And just to kind of, in Nicaragua, that's a huge thing. We know that there's entire laboratories full of people who just do between the surveillance of your Facebook and Twitter to know who is speaking out against the government, so that they can be, if they work for the government, they can be fired, or they can be persecuted and be put on the list. But also, these same people also go and create debates, and they start, arguing against the influencers and trying to create these false debates. But when you go into their accounts, you see that it was created a week ago, and they're all over the place. It's hundreds and thousands of fake accounts that are creating this huge disturbance.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about problems, but Navia just had this question, which I think is great, which is, they're the problems, but how do we talk about using speech or platforms to inspire people to care about social good? Especially when they're in institutions that maybe exploit folks. So how do we flip it, and how do we spread positive messages, and what are the best platforms for that? Go ahead, Ben. Is Snapchat?
Is this question here? Okay.
Not this one, the one I just asked you.
Okay. Well,
you can pay attention to me for.
Yeah. Sorry, I was reading that one, and then because it switched. Yeah. What was the?
You're not supposed to.
So I'm asking about how do we get platforms to inspire to inspire people to actually do social good. Because it's one thing to talk about all the negatives, right? And, but it's another thing to say, look, there's harping on the negatives, but there's also putting positive energy out there and putting positive messages.
Well, so there's a couple of things. I mean, one, again, we believe in we believe in human editorial expertise. We have a team of journalists who very often are creating stories about important issues that are happening around the world and giving people an opportunity not just to learn about issues, but how can they contribute, right? And it doesn't have to be a financial contribution. It can be just how can you get involved from an activism point of view. So we're doing that. And back to what I said, I think, look, if you have a service where people are coming back every day and spending 30, 40, 50 minutes, more than an hour a day, this is an opportunity to say, hey, these are the issues, right? This is what you need to know. This is how you register to vote. This is where you find your polling place. Get out and vote and make a difference. And we're doing it, and I think actually, to be fair, I think Twitter's doing it, Facebook's doing it. So I think there's two sides to it. One is education. One is showing people, how can they not only learn about issues, but how can they get involved? And then the second part is how can we actually get people more involved in the political process directly?
Well, what we do at the ACLU is we use the social media. We don't expect the companies themselves to do all the work. And one of the things our communications department does especially is storytelling. So we do actual videos of our clients so that people can share. Here's this family that was separated at the border. Listen to the 4-year-old. See for yourself what's going on, and we get a million hits on some of these things. We got over 1 million hits for when we challenged the travel ban.
Yeah.
And people are really interested in the stories of people and find it really inspirational. I think in terms of why should I care about an immigrant family? To actually hear them and see them. Talking about their experience, I think, is something that social media is a tool that we use to try to get that message out there.
Yeah.
Right. And Mai, how do we spread these positive messages?
I think the social media platform should have the policy statement refusing to comply with the local laws that silent dissent, like cybersecurity law, and have to report how they respect freedom of expression. That's the very important work of a social media company.
Right.
And I think that one of the kind of biggest added values is how social media can turn into us physically being together as well. So for instance, activism or community service, through social media, you get to know where it is that you can contribute in your own local community, where you can meet up with other people that are also trying to do good in their spaces. That's been much of how it's served us as well as the storytelling. But also, for instance, an initiative that could happen is if you are promoting community service or of that sort, maybe you can receive free boosts from these groups, and as kind of their support for anyone doing real kind of activism on the ground.
All right, so we don't have that much time left, but I wanted to ask each of you the 2 things you want folks in the audience to leave here with today when it comes to freedom of expression. I'll start with you, Mai. The 2 things.
Yes, I think the more we debate about freedom of expression, the more we will improve freedom of expression everywhere in the world.
Julio?
Sorry to be a little bit selfish, but what I would like to leave everyone here is there are thousands of young Nicaraguan university and other young people who are fighting for freedom of expression, have been doing it for the past 6 months. We know that injustice thrives in darkness, and we need everyone else here to spread the word and do whatever you can from your spaces. There's the hashtag SOS Nicaragua. Follow that and push politically within your own spaces in your own country so that there can be freedom of expression in Nicaragua. That would be my takeaway. Thank you.
Susan?
Well, I guess a couple of things in terms of what I would like people to take away. That number one is essentially what Julio was saying, is just about the importance of everybody's speech, not just what you think and whether you can say what you want. And I think what I would urge you all to do is, instead of waiting for somebody to have a program for you to do it, figure out a way to have a conversation with somebody you expect you're going to disagree with, whether it's at Thanksgiving dinner or whatever it is. Take on the relative with a completely different political viewpoint and see if you can find common ground. See if you can persuade each other that you should each be supporting each other's right to say what you think. And to me, that's the bottom line. It's the empathy. To me, civil liberties are really nothing more than the golden rule. If I wouldn't want you to shut me up and keep me from saying what I want to say, then I shouldn't be willing to have the same happen to you.
And Ben?
Yeah, I think it's that if social media wants to survive as an institution, these companies have to rethink how their business model works, how content is distributed, and how content is regulated on the platform. Because what's happening now, if it continues, is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for democracy. And I think you're going to see a lot of changes if we can't do a better job. And then I do have to say, our head of political partnerships went to University of Chicago, and she said she would kill me if I did not mention that when you're at the club where we checked in, you can't step on the seal on the floor because it's very bad luck. So I just want to tell you all that she was going to be very upset if I didn't mention that. So
all right.
Remember that.
So with that, don't step on the seal. I wanted to say thank you to our panelists for a wonderful discussion. And I wanted to say thank you to President, Secretary Clinton, and Chelsea for having us all here. And then thank you most of all to you guys for your participation and your attendance. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the plenary session is now concluded. Your next sessions will begin at 10:45 a.m. in your respective meeting rooms. Thank you.